mynews.studio.
So, at COP28, just one sentence changed the whole landscape of climate politics. When leaders agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, what does that actually mean for us in practical terms?
Right, and just to anchor us, today's date is 2025-10-11. Let's begin with some context. Back in December 2023, almost 200 countries gathered in Dubai for COP28. For the first time, they formally agreed to the language, transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner, with the aim of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Why is that wording such a big deal?
Well, for nearly 3 decades, UN climate negotiations carefully avoided naming fossil fuels directly in their final agreements. This time, it's explicit. Fossil fuels are front and center in the conversation. It's not just about coal or so-called unabated fuels anymore. It's all fossil fuels. That's a real shift. But does this mean countries actually have to stop using fossil fuels?
Not necessarily. The agreement stopped short of saying phase out, which a lot of vulnerable countries and campaigners wanted. Instead, it's about a gradual transition away. That wording isn't as binding as many hoped. Countries can interpret it to suit their own interests. And frankly, some might look for ways around it. Isn't that a challenge when it comes to holding countries accountable?
Absolutely, it is. The agreement's power really depends on mechanisms like the global stocktake. That was completed for the first time at COP28. It sets a baseline for tracking progress. Every 5 years, countries have to report what they're doing on climate, and by 2025, they're expected to update their national plans based on these findings. But since the language is flexible, enforcement is
kind of weak, right?
Exactly, especially for countries whose economies depend on fossil fuel exports. What does this mean for them?
It's a massive challenge. Think about oil-rich countries or regions that rely heavily on coal. There are likely to be job losses in sectors like mining and drilling. Governments will need to replace major sources of revenue and find new sectors to invest in. That's not simple. The agreement mentions new adaptation finance and the loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries, but so far,
the funding isn't really there yet, right? And the details on how that money will be distributed aren't clear.
Exactly. So the big question is how these changes will affect people on the ground, workers, local economies, communities. The transition could be quite disruptive.
Yes, millions of lives could be upended. People working in fossil fuel industries might need to retrain, and entire local economies could face hardship. The agreement does say the transition should be just and equitable, but without real financial backing, that's tough to guarantee. Do you think market forces, like investor decisions, could speed up the transition, even if the language isn't strictly binding?
Possibly, because for the first time, fossil fuels are directly named in a global agreement. That signals something to investors, markets, and industries worldwide. Even though it's not a legal requirement, expectations are shifting, so companies might accelerate their move to renewables to stay ahead. But there's still a gap between what's promised and what's actually done. Is this the real beginning of the end for fossil fuels?
It's definitely a turning point in global climate policy, but it's just the beginning. The agreement puts every country on notice. It's time to update national plans. But progress depends on stronger commitments, real accountability, and crucially, financial support. There's a risk that the flexible language lets countries slow-walk change. Can the loss and damage fund help create more balance for nations already facing the worst climate impacts?
It's a step, and the fund is now operational. That's new. But the initial funding is pretty limited, and there's still a lot of uncertainty about how the money will be distributed. The most vulnerable nations need more, and they need it quickly, as climate impacts keep escalating. Do you think the next round of climate talks will set tougher deadlines and clearer rules?
That's what many are hoping for. The global stocktake is meant to build pressure for more ambition each cycle, but everything still depends on political will and real financing. The world has finally agreed to move away from fossil fuels. Now it's about how quickly that happens and who steps up to lead.
That's our deep dive for today. COP28 brought the first global consensus on moving beyond fossil fuels, but what really matters is how it gets done, making sure the transition is effective, accountable, and fair.
Thanks for tuning in. Today we unpacked the historic COP28 deal, talked about the challenges with accountability, and explored the social and economic impacts of the transition. The move away from fossil fuels has started, but what comes next is what really counts.
Thank you for listening. This episode was brought to you by mynews.studio. Give it a try for free.